I watched as Karen jammed a master key into the lock of my truck, my '72 F100, the one I rebuilt with my best friend Jake, right there on my property. When I stepped out to stop her, she didn't even flinch. She just smiled and said, "I'm just relocating it for community regulations." So let me give you some context. I didn't move into this neighborhood thinking I was going to get tangled up in some HOA nightmare. Honestly, I just wanted a quiet life. After 10 years as a military cop, dealing with the absolute worst of humanity day in and day out, all I wanted was peace and some time to myself. I found this place, a modest little home with a big garage, perfect for me and my truck. And trust me, that garage was the selling point. Now, this truck, it's not just any truck, it's a '72 Ford F100. Cherry red, restored from the ground up with my best friend, Jake. We found it rusting away in some farmer's field, barely recognizable. Jake was the engine guy. He could make anything run, but I was the one who worked on the body, spent weekends sanding it, tuning it, painting it. Every bolt in that truck was like a part of me, a part of us. I lost Jake on a tour I couldn't go on. It was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and that truck? It was the last thing we really worked on together. It was a piece of him that I still had, something to hold on to. So, yeah, you could say I was a little protective of it. When I first moved in, everything was perfect. The neighbors kept to themselves, the streets were quiet. I could work on my truck in the garage without anyone giving me a hard time. But then came the HOA. At first, it was small stuff. I didn't think much of it, just a letter here and there, reminding me about community standards. You know, the usual don't park your trash cans too close to the curb kind of nonsense. Fine, I could deal with that. But then it started getting weird. One day I got a notice saying my grass was too high. I checked. It wasn't. It was a quarter-inch over the limit or something, but that was it. So I trimmed it, and I figured that would be the end of it. But that was just the beginning. A few weeks later, I got another notice. This time, it was about my trash cans. Apparently, they were visible from the street for 2 hours after garbage day. And, I mean, really? Who was watching my trash cans that closely? I paid the fine just to avoid the headache, but at this point, I was starting to get pissed. The neighborhood was practically perfect. Every house was beige, every lawn was meticulously manicured, and there wasn't a single swing set or basketball hoop in sight. It was like living in a movie set where the director forgot to add any fun. And that's when I started hearing about Karen. One of my neighbors, Louis, a retired mailman in his 70s, let me in on the secret. He's this small, cheerful guy who loves his garden gnomes more than anything. He's got a whole damn village of them in his front yard. I'll never forget the day Louis leaned over the fence and said, "She's a tyrant." He told me Karen had been running the HOA for years and had gotten elected on a platform of maintaining property values. What that really meant, Louis said, was making everyone's life miserable. He told me stories about families who were forced to repaint their doors because Karen didn't like the shade of blue they chose. Or that young couple who had to tear down a brand new swing set because it wasn't approved by the HOA. Like, really? A swing set? But it wasn't until I got the first notice about my truck that I really saw what was going on. It was a Saturday morning and I was waxing the truck, just giving it some love after a few weeks of work. Karen knocked on my door. When I opened it, she didn't even say hello. She just pointed at my truck and said, "That vehicle is an eyesore. It's lowering the tone of the neighborhood." Now, I wasn't the kind of guy who'd get in someone's face, but this hit a nerve. I took a deep breath and told her, "This isn't a commercial vehicle. It's a classic, and it's my property." She didn't care. In her world, anything that didn't fit the perfect image was a problem. She said my truck belonged in the garage, but that's where I'd had it. Until I was working on it, of course. I thought, fine, whatever. I'll take it easy. It's just one of those Karen things. But then the notices kept coming. After that, it was one thing after another. The non-approved welcome mat on my front porch? Fined. My garden hose improperly coiled? Fined. I even got hit with a fine for listening to music in my garage. Classic rock, mind you. On a Saturday, nothing loud, just some tunes. They hit me with a fine for noise pollution. I was getting hit with $50 fines left and right, and it was starting to wear me down. But I figured, okay, I'll just pay them off, stay under the radar, and eventually they'd stop. But it wasn't stopping. In fact, it was just the beginning. Karen had made it clear that this wasn't just about rules. It was about control. And when I saw her trying to break into my truck, the last connection I had to Jake, I knew I had to make a choice. Either I could keep my head down and let her bully me, or I could stand up and fight. But Karen had no idea who she was dealing with, and she wasn't going to like it when she found out. The first real run-in with Karen happened one morning when I was out in the garage, getting ready to take the F100 for a spin. I was just wiping it down, enjoying the quiet of my driveway, when I saw her walking up. No knock on the door, no, "Hey, how's it going?" Just that same smug look she always wore, like she was about to drop some bombshell that was supposed to be a big deal. She pointed straight at my truck and said, "That vehicle is an eyesore. It's lowering the tone of the neighborhood." I swear, she said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like this truck was the source of all evil in the neighborhood. I stood there, just staring at her for a second, trying to process how someone could be so uptight about a damn truck. I didn't yell or get all defensive, I just tried to stay calm. "It's a classic," I said. "Not a work truck, and it's my property. I don't see how it affects you." But Karen wasn't hearing it. She sniffed the air like she could smell the motor oil from 10 feet away and went straight for the jugular. "This isn't a place for hobbies that involve grease and noise," she said, all high and mighty. "This is a respectable community. We can't have things like that parked in front of your house." I couldn't believe it. My truck, my pride and joy, was being called an eyesore. An eyesore. I could feel my temper starting to flare up, but I kept it in check. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of making me lose my cool. "It's my driveway," I reminded her. "It's my truck. I'm not doing anything wrong." But she wasn't done. Oh no, she came back with some fancy words about how my truck didn't meet community standards and needed to be moved. I tried to keep calm even though I was getting more pissed with every second. I mean, what the hell was next? Were they going to tell me I couldn't park my own damn car in my own damn driveway? I had already gotten a couple of those little notices in the mail, each one more ridiculous than the last. The grass wasn't cut right, or my trash cans weren't properly hidden. But this was crossing the line. I didn't yell, I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I just gave her a look, the kind that lets you know you're done playing nice. "Karen, I'm not hiding my truck. It's my property. You can't just tell me what to do with it." And that's when she pulled out her trump card. "I'm giving you a warning," she said, like she was the freaking queen of the neighborhood. "I'll be watching. Keep that thing out of sight." I just stood there, watching her turn and march off like she had just handed down a royal decree. It was like she thought she was above it all, like the rules didn't apply to her, just everyone else. I could feel my blood boiling, but I stayed quiet. I wasn't about to let her get the best of me, but that wasn't the end of it. No, Karen wasn't done. It wasn't just about the truck anymore. It was like she was waiting for any excuse to come after me, to make my life miserable. From that point on, I could see the writing on the wall. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was on a mission to make everyone conform to her perfect little world. And I was next. I had no idea what was coming, but I'd soon find out just how far Karen and her little HOA empire would go to make sure everyone followed her vision. It wasn't going to be pretty. Things didn't calm down after Karen's little warning. In fact, it only got worse. Once she knew she could push me around, it was like she saw me as an easy target. She started finding the smallest things to complain about, things I never even thought twice about before. It was like she had some checklist of ways to make my life a living hell. It started with the lawn. I swear, the guy from next door, Louie, probably had the best kept yard in the whole damn neighborhood, but it wasn't good enough for Karen. She had to come over and inspect my grass. Not because it was tall, mind you, but because she'd noticed a blotch in the green where the sun hit a little harder. She was all about appearances, so if my lawn wasn't flawless, it was a problem. I got another fine for improper landscaping. It was for one patch of grass that looked a little different because of the sun. I don't even know how that was possible, but I didn't back down. I took out the lawnmower again, shaved everything down even more than before, just to be sure. But you know, Karen, she didn't stop. She came back a few days later and said the bushes in the front were too wild. Too wild? They were perfectly normal bushes, nothing out of control. But in Karen's world, if you didn't manicure every damn inch of your property, you were a threat to the neighborhood's aesthetic value. At this point, I was starting to get a little fed up. I paid the fines, yes, but every single letter I got felt like a slap in the face. These weren't just about rules anymore. This was about her control, her need to make everyone bow down to her idea of perfection. It was like I was in some bizarre competition I didn't even know I entered. Then came the trash cans. I got hit with another notice saying they were visible for more than 2 hours after trash day. Again, I couldn't believe it. Trash cans. I even had a note that the lid wasn't properly secured wet, which seriously was one of the most ridiculous things I'd ever heard. So I paid the fine, stuffed the can even more carefully next time, and figured that would be the end of it. But no. The next thing I know, I get another violation, this time for noise pollution. I almost lost it at this point. The violation wasn't for blasting music or throwing a party or anything loud. Number 2. It was because I was listening to classic rock in my garage while I worked on the truck. I didn't have the door wide open. The garage was half closed, but apparently the HOA thought the sound of Born to Be Wild from an old Ford was disturbing the peace. At this point, I was like, are you kidding me? It was on a Saturday afternoon. I wasn't even in the street, just in my garage, minding my business. But it didn't matter to them. The letter came with another fine. A small one, sure, but it wasn't about the money, it was the principle. Every time I turned around, it was one thing after another, and it didn't stop. And through all of this, Karen was always lurking. She'd pop by randomly, clipboard in hand, looking over my property like she was the queen of the block, judging every inch. I had enough of it, but I didn't know what to do. The problem wasn't just with the fines, it was with the way the entire neighborhood had started to feel like a cage. It was suffocating. But it wasn't until I got the letter about the truck that things really hit a new level. The letter basically said my truck was improperly parked, even though it had been in the same spot for months. The next line was something about how it was a work vehicle and how it lowered property values because of its oversized tires. I stared at the letter for a while. The idea that they could tell me what I could park in my own damn driveway, let alone tell me how my truck lowered property values, was absurd. I didn't even know what to think anymore. So I decided to fight back. I didn't pay the fine. I wrote them a letter citing the state law about classic cars and their distinction from work vehicles. I sent it with proof of the truck's registration, which clearly showed it was a personal, non-commercial vehicle. I thought that would be enough, right? That's what any reasonable person would think. I mean, facts and logic should win out here, right? But no. A few days later, I got a response. It was just a single sentence signed by Karen. The committee's decision is final. No explanation, no logic, just the words, final decision, as if she were a dictator of some medieval kingdom. No matter how much evidence I had, how much I argued, I had no chance. That's when I realized it wasn't about the truck. It wasn't about rules. It was about control. It was about Karen and her husband, Richard, pushing everyone into submission, one petty rule at a time. And I was just another guy on their list. But Karen didn't know me. She didn't know I wasn't going to back down. And now, it wasn't just about my truck anymore. It was about fighting back against a system that was built to break people down. It was time to stop playing by their rules. At this point, I was just about done with the HOA, but I wasn't going to start any crazy fights without trying to fix this the right way first. I wasn't some hothead who just wanted to flip the bird to the whole damn neighborhood, even if Karen definitely had it coming. So I decided to do what I thought was the smart thing. I tried to resolve it peacefully. I figured if I could show them I wasn't the enemy, we could all move on. I started with the letter I sent. It was calm, reasonable, too reasonable, in fact. I quoted the state's definition of a classic vehicle versus a commercial one. I made sure the tone was polite, even though I could barely hold my temper when I was writing it. I attached a copy of my registration, highlighting the fact that it clearly stated my truck was a personal vehicle, not something used for work. The argument was solid. I felt confident. I even thought about sending a thank you card for the great work the HOA had done for the community in general. I didn't send it, but you get the idea. I dropped the letter off at the HOA office myself, hoping that would settle it. You know, an adult conversation. That was the plan. A couple of days later, I got a response, and that's when I realized I was wasting my time. The letter was short, too short, just one line. It said, "The committee's decision is final." There was no reference to the truck, no real explanation, nothing. Just that line, signed by Karen herself. I stared at the letter for a while, trying to keep my cool. I mean, what did I expect? I was dealing with someone who treated rules like their personal playbook, and the committee wasn't much better. At this point, I was getting frustrated, but I wasn't giving up yet. I'd spent too much time and energy trying to fix this quietly to just let it slide. So I decided to go over Karen's head. I went to the next HOA meeting. I thought maybe if I explained things in person, I'd get a fair hearing. I wanted to show them I wasn't some unreasonable guy, just someone who wanted to enjoy his property without being harassed. The meeting was a joke. Karen was there, sitting at the head of the table like some queen holding court, surrounded by her little entourage. Richard was off to the side, looking smug as usual. There were a couple of other neighbors, mostly people who kept their heads down and didn't make waves, but it was clear they were all just going along with whatever Karen said. It was like they were scared to speak up. That's when it hit me. It wasn't just Karen. This was a whole system built on her power. I was just a cog in the machine. When I finally had a chance to speak, I did my best to stay calm. I explained that the truck was a personal vehicle, not a work truck, and that I had all the paperwork to prove it. I tried to appeal to their logic, even though I knew Karen and Richard weren't interested in logic. I kept it civil. I even mentioned how I'd tried to be a good neighbor by maintaining my property and following the rules as best as I could. But Karen cut me off halfway through my sentence, as if she already had her mind made up. "We've already discussed this," she said, flipping through the papers like she had better things to do. "The decision stands. You will need to move the truck." And just like that, it was over. No discussion, no compromise, nothing. She didn't even look at me when she spoke. It was like I was invisible, like I didn't even matter. I could feel my blood start to boil. All that time I spent trying to play nice, trying to follow the rules, and here was Karen, just shutting me down like she always did. But I didn't snap. I stayed calm, but I knew then that this wasn't about a truck. It was about control. It was about her and Richard making sure everyone else knew their place. So I walked out of that meeting knowing that no matter what I did, they wouldn't listen. I tried, I really did, to settle this peacefully. I tried to keep my head down and play by the rules, but now I knew I wasn't going to get anywhere unless I fought back. That's when I started thinking bigger. If the HOA wouldn't listen to reason, maybe it was time to get creative. So you know how it goes. The more you deal with the HOA, the more you start to see the cracks in their little empire. At first, I just thought Karen was a pain in the ass. But the longer this dragged on, the more I realized she wasn't just some petty bureaucrat. She wasn't just harassing me over my truck and my grass. She was part of something much bigger. It started with little things I noticed around the neighborhood. For example, one day I saw a neighbor, Tom, putting his house up for sale. Now, Tom wasn't exactly the life of the party, but he'd been in the neighborhood for years, always keeping to himself, maintaining his place. When I asked Louis about it, he told me that Tom had been hit with constant fines for the most random things, like the kind of fines that weren't even worth fighting, but over time, they added up. Louis said that Tom had been trying to sell for a while, but he couldn't afford the fines anymore, so he had to sell his house at a loss. And that wasn't just Tom. Louis had heard whispers about other people getting squeezed out, too. I wasn't the only one they were after. In fact, I was starting to wonder if the HOA had a plan. I mean, think about it. Every time they hit someone with fines, the pressure kept building. People were either paying up or selling out. Something didn't sit right. That's when it hit me. What if this was all part of a bigger game? What if Karen and Richard weren't just getting off on bossing people around? What if they were actually making money off this? At first, I just thought I was being paranoid, but then I started putting the pieces together. I dug into some property records, talked to a few neighbors, and the more I found, the more I realized I wasn't crazy. There was something seriously shady going on. Turns out Karen and Richard weren't just pushing people around for fun, they were running a real estate scam, a big one. I'll tell you what really clued me in. One night, Louis told me he saw Richard heading over to a house that had just gone into foreclosure. I didn't think much of it at first, just figured it was some weird coincidence. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Richard was the HOA treasurer. He had all the access to the fines, the liens, everything. And there was one thing I knew for sure. Foreclosures were a gold mine for people like him. They could buy up these houses for pennies on the dollar, flip them, and make a fortune. That's when I started getting serious. I got my hands on more property records, some old HOA documents, and I started seeing the same names pop up over and over again. There was this LLC, Chestnut Holdings, that kept buying up these homes. And get this, the address for the company was linked to Richard. It wasn't a huge leap from there to realize that he and Karen were behind it all. They were using the HOA to bully people into losing their homes, then snatching them up cheap. But that wasn't even the worst part. The twist, the real kicker? I found out that they weren't just in it for the real estate. They were in bed with a city councilman named Arthur Vance. The same Vance who always talked about how he was trying to improve the community, keep property values up, blah, blah, blah. Turns out he was feeding Richard insider info about a new highway project. This new highway, it was going to be built just a few miles away from our neighborhood. And when that happened, property values in the area were going to shoot up, big time. Richard and Karen weren't just grabbing houses to flip them, they were specifically buying up homes that they knew would skyrocket in value once the highway project was announced. And the real kicker? Arthur Vance was getting a cut of the profits for feeding them the inside scoop. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I knew the HOA was a pain, but this was something else. It was corruption on a whole new level. It was criminal. These people weren't just trying to squeeze a few extra bucks out of me, they were running an entire scam that involved foreclosures, stolen properties, and insider trading, and they were doing it right under everyone's noses, using the HOA as their little personal tool. At that point, I knew there was no going back. I wasn't just fighting for my truck anymore. I was fighting to expose a conspiracy that could ruin a lot of lives, mine included if I wasn't careful. I had the evidence. I had it all. Emails, property records, the connection to Vance. But now, the question wasn't just how to deal with Karen and Richard, it was whether I was ready to take down a whole corrupt system, one that had been built to prey on people like me. I wasn't sure where to start, but I knew I couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything I had uncovered. Once I had everything in front of me, proof of the scam, the emails, the hidden company, the connections to Vance, it hit me that I wasn't just dealing with Karen and Richard anymore. This wasn't just some neighborhood feud. This was bigger. This was a conspiracy that could land them all in serious trouble if the right people found out. And that's where I had to get smart. I spent the next few days sorting through everything. I had the proof, yes, but how the hell was I going to use it? I wasn't about to just march up to the local police or the city council with a stack of papers and expect them to listen. This was going to take time, strategy, and a hell of a lot of patience. I wasn't going to make any rookie mistakes. I had to outplay them at their own game. First thing I did was get in touch with Ben, Jake's older brother. He's a lawyer, smart guy, but kind of conservative in how he thinks. He's all about the play it safe approach, which didn't exactly fit what I had in mind, but I needed his legal advice. I ran him through the basics of what I had discovered. He listened quiet for a while, then said, "Mark, this is serious. You've got a conspiracy here, and it's a big one. But you need to be careful. These people aren't just HOA bullies. They're connected, and they have the power to make this disappear." That's when I knew I had to go beyond just exposing them. I had to make it count. Ben wasn't wrong. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just go public right away. I had to build the case. I needed something they couldn't ignore, something that would make them feel the pressure. I needed to hit them where it would hurt the most, right in their pockets. I thought about how they'd been running this scam for so long, using the HOA as their cover, milking people out of their homes and funneling the money into this shady LLC. And then it hit me. They were making money off this scam, sure, but they were also breaking laws, financial crimes, fraud, insider trading with Vance. If I could expose their illegal activities, it wouldn't just be about the HOA, it would be about everything. And that's when I started to formulate a plan. The first part of the plan was to gather more evidence, something I could take to the authorities that would make it impossible for them to ignore. I needed to prove that Richard and Karen were funneling HOA fines into their LLC using the money to buy up properties. I also needed to show the connection with Vance, because he was the key. Once I had all that, I could go to the right people who wouldn't just look the other way because Karen was the HOA president. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed help. Louis, my gnome-loving neighbor, had been invaluable in getting me the intel I needed, but he couldn't help with the heavy lifting. So I called in someone I trusted, S, an old buddy of mine from the military. He wasn't just good with tactics, he was great at gathering intel, moving silently, getting into places he wasn't supposed to be. If anyone could help me get into Richard and Karen's files and find the smoking gun, it was him. Once I had the team together, it was time to get creative. I needed to get inside their house, specifically Richard's office. I knew that's where the real dirt would be. I'd spent weeks thinking about how to do it, and finally I came up with an idea. I had to play into their own obsession with rules and their need to control everything. The plan was simple but risky. I was going to propose something completely outrageous to the HOA, something that would make them have to come over and inspect my property. I decided to submit a ridiculous renovation proposal to the HOA, something so absurd that Karen and Richard wouldn't be able to resist demanding an in-person consultation. I figured if I could get them to my house, I could buy myself some time to get into their place. I came up with the idea of renovating my house into some kind of tacky, over-the-top monstrosity. I was talking about metallic purple paint, racing stripes, and a giant chrome eagle in the front yard. Something so outlandish that even Karen, with her insane need for control, wouldn't be able to ignore it. And when they inevitably demanded a meeting to talk about it, I would just play the part of the clueless homeowner, pretending I had no idea how ridiculous the whole thing was. Meanwhile, Louis was going to play his part. He would go to Richard and Karen's house, pretending to comply with the gnome fine and needing their approval for his garden ornaments. He was going to be so irritating that Karen wouldn't be able to resist, and while she was distracted with Louis, I'd have a backup plan to get someone into their office. I couldn't do it myself. I needed someone who was good at getting in and out unnoticed, and that's where S came in. Everything had to go perfectly. If I screwed up even one detail, it could all fall apart. But I had a gut feeling this would work. I had the evidence, I had the strategy, and I wasn't about to let Karen and Richard get away with this anymore. So that's what I did. I set the plan in motion, piece by piece, and I waited, knowing that this was my shot. If I pulled this off, it wasn't just about my truck anymore. It was about exposing a whole network of corruption, and I was going to make sure Karen and Richard were the ones left holding the bag. I won't lie to you, it felt like everything was on the line. I had spent weeks setting this whole thing up, gathering evidence, getting the right people in place, and preparing for the moment when Karen and Richard would make their move. But like with any plan, things didn't go exactly the way I expected. First, it was the meeting. I had made my proposal, all ridiculous and over the top, of course, metallic purple paint, chrome eagles, stuff that would make even the HOA's most strict members recoil in horror. I knew they'd bite. I knew they'd want to inspect it in person because they couldn't resist the urge to control. And sure enough, the next day I got the email. Karen and Richard wanted to meet. I was feeling good. Too good, maybe. I set everything up at home, cleaning up the place just enough to make it look like I was really serious about my absurd proposal. I didn't want them thinking I was just messing around, even though I was. I was playing the fool, and I had to look the part. But as the meeting time got closer, something started to feel off. I got a text from Louis. He was running late, but I wasn't worried. Louis was a bit of a mess, but he always came through when it counted. S, my military buddy, was in place, ready to execute his part of the plan. I opened the door when Karen and Richard arrived. They looked at my house like it was a crime scene. Richard's eyes practically twitched when he saw the plans. He was pissed, but he kept it in check. Karen, on the other hand, was seething, barely holding back the words. I could tell they hated it, but I didn't care. This wasn't about my ridiculous house plans anymore. This was about what I was going to pull off next. We sat down in the living room and I played my part. I rambled on about why I thought metallic purple would really pop, how a chrome eagle would give the place a patriotic flair. I didn't know how I kept a straight face, but I did. The whole time I was watching Karen's reaction. She was fuming and I could see it. The more I dragged it out, the angrier she got. It was working. Then came the moment. Karen stood up, slamming her clipboard down on the coffee table. She pointed at me and shouted, "This is absolutely unacceptable. You have no taste. This is a flagrant violation of every standard this community holds dear." She was close to losing it completely, and I could see Richard's frustration starting to boil over, too. He kept glancing at the truck in the garage like he couldn't stand the sight of it. But I had no intention of letting this drag out forever. I needed to get them distracted, and I needed it now. I nodded, pretending to take her seriously. All right, I get it. Maybe we need to walk through the neighborhood and get a sense of what's been approved before we move forward. I had to get them out of the house. I needed them to leave so Louis could do his part. Just as I suggested the walk, I saw Louis walking up the street. Perfect timing. He looked like he was in a panic, holding a tape measure, acting like a guy who had just made an important discovery. I shot him a look, and he knew what to do. He rang Karen's doorbell like he was the most awkward person on the planet. He was going to get Karen so wrapped up in nonsense that she'd have no choice but to go over and see what he was rambling about. Sure enough, Karen stormed out, Richard reluctantly following her. I watched them both walk across the street as I stood there, letting out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. That was the signal? I dashed to the back door where S was waiting. He moved quickly, his hands steady, methodical. I had already scoped the place out earlier, so I knew exactly where Richard kept his office. It was a small room near the back, filled with piles of paperwork and files. S got to work, pulling out a small set of tools and picking the lock like it was nothing. I stood in the front yard, pretending to fidget with my ridiculous proposal. I needed to be there in case anything went wrong. I could hear Louis yelling across the street about gnome to grass ratios, or whatever it was that was supposed to be keeping Karen occupied. Louis was doing his best to act as crazy as possible, making Karen argue over the most ridiculous things. I'd never seen someone so committed to a role in my life. And then, it happened. I saw Richard walking back toward the house, his eyes darting around. My heart skipped. I had no idea how much time S had left, but I couldn't risk getting caught now. Richard opened the door, and I knew I had to act fast. I casually stepped over to the side of the house, trying to stay out of sight. I peeked around the corner and saw Richard pulling out his phone, probably to call Karen or do some damage control on the house. That's when I realized this wasn't just a game anymore. They were nervous. They knew something was up. Just as I was about to step back into the yard and keep up the act, I saw S slip out the back door. He gave me a quick nod. He had what we needed. He had gone through Richard's files, accessed everything on his computer, and grabbed the files that tied Richard to the Shady LLC and the emails with Vance. This was the moment we'd been waiting for. But as I walked back to the front of the house, that's when I felt it. The weight of what was about to happen next. This wasn't just about exposing them anymore. It wasn't just about my truck. We had the evidence to destroy everything they had built. but it was going to take one hell of a push to make sure it didn't all fall apart. As I watched Karen and Richard walk back to their house, I knew the game had changed. What we had in our hands wasn't just a neighborhood battle anymore. It was the end of their entire empire, and I was ready to make sure they went down. The moment I had been building up to for weeks, maybe months, had finally arrived. I had the evidence, Richard and Karen's entire scheme laid bare, emails, files, everything. But I wasn't just going to slip a few papers into the hands of a police officer and call it a day. I needed to make sure they were exposed for who they really were, publicly, with no way to wiggle out of it. I started by calling Ben. I wasn't exactly sure how to play this part, so I needed some advice. We can't just drop this on some investigator and hope for the best. We need leverage. If we do this the right way, they'll have no choice but to fall apart. Ben's voice was steady, but I could hear the concern beneath it. You've got everything we need to bury them, but we need the right audience. That's when the idea hit me. It had to be public. It had to be something that would make Karen and Richard face the consequences, and the only way to do that was to make sure everyone knew what they had been doing. The HOA wasn't just about petty fines anymore. It was a criminal enterprise. And this wasn't just a fight between neighbors. It was a fight against a system built on greed and control. The whole neighborhood needed to know. I decided the best way to do this was at the next HOA meeting. It was the perfect setting. All of Karen's loyal little followers would be there, hanging on every word she said. If I could make them see the truth, if I could get the rest of the neighborhood to see what was really going on, it would be over for them. I showed up early, my heart racing. I wasn't nervous about the confrontation, I'd gotten used to that, but about what was coming next. I had to make sure every word counted. If I slipped up, if I gave them any wiggle room, they'd find a way to turn it around. I couldn't afford to give them that chance. As the meeting started, Karen walked in, all smiles, acting like she owned the place. She looked right at me, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flash of fear in her eyes. She quickly masked it with a fake smile, but I knew she was on edge. She had no idea what was about to hit her. I waited for the right moment. Karen launched into her usual HOA business, talking about lawn violations, people's doors being the wrong shade of white, the usual nonsense. But when she started complaining about me again, about my improper parking, I knew it was time to speak up. I stood up, slow and deliberate, and the whole room went silent. Actually, Karen, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet, I think it's time we talk about something a little more serious. I could see her freeze just for a second, and I knew I had her attention. I went into it. Bit by bit, showing them the documents, the emails, everything. I didn't rush. I let every piece of evidence speak for itself. I laid it out for the whole room to see. The HOA fines, the illegal business dealings, the fraudulent properties, they were all there. I even had a copy of the emails with Vance, the city councilman, showing how he had been feeding them insider information. The shock on Karen's face was priceless. Her usual smug demeanor started to crack as I read aloud some of the emails. The room was dead silent. The other members of the HOA just stared at the papers, at me, and at Karen and Richard. They had no idea what to do with this information. They weren't sure how to react, but I could see them starting to shift, starting to question the people they had been blindly following. Karen, I said, my voice calm but firm, you've been using this position to push people around, force them into financial ruin, and line your pockets with stolen money. You've been breaking the law, and now the whole neighborhood knows it. She stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no words came. Richard, who had been sitting next to her, looked like he was going to explode. He shot up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, but I wasn't done yet. Oh, and by the way, I said, pulling out one last piece of evidence, here's the property deed to the house that Karen and Richard just bought for next to nothing, just a couple of streets over. That's one of the homes that was foreclosed due to their little fines. I watched as the color drained from Karen's face. The room was buzzing now, whispers flying between the neighbors as they started to piece it all together. Karen tried to regain control. She stood up, attempting to talk over me, but it was too late. The damage was done. The entire room had seen it. They knew what she and Richard were doing now. There was no going back. But Karen wasn't done. She tried to make some excuse, some ridiculous claim that it was all a misunderstanding, that the fines were just necessary to keep the neighborhood nice. But the others weren't buying it. Slowly, one by one, they started speaking up. A couple of the older neighbors, people who had been intimidated by the HOA before, began to voice their concerns. Even Louis, who had been quietly sitting in the back, raised his hand to share how he had seen Richard sneaking around to buy up homes. The whole meeting turned into a mess, but in the best possible way. By the time it ended, Karen and Richard were backed into a corner, and the other HOA members were looking at them like they were the criminals they were. But the best part? They couldn't talk their way out of it. I left that meeting feeling like I had just watched a building collapse. The truth was out. The scam was exposed, and the people who had been pulling the strings were finally being held accountable. It wasn't over, not yet, but this was the beginning of the end for Karen and Richard. The moment they were exposed, their power vanished. The neighborhood changed after that. People started standing up for themselves. People started questioning the fines, the rules, the control. Slowly but surely, the HOA lost its grip. And Karen, she lost everything. The investigation started. Lawyers were called in. By the time the dust settled, the HOA was no more. I'll never forget that look on Karen's face when she realized that everything she had built, everything she thought she had control over, was crumbling in front of her. It was like she was watching her world burn, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. As for me, I gotta keep my truck, I gotta keep my property, and more importantly, I got my peace back. I won't lie, there's something about seeing the whole thing unfold, watching Karen and Richard get what they deserved. That feels good, but it's not that it's about revenge, at least not for me. Honestly, it's more about the fact that I finally got to take control of something that had been taken from me. And the best part? It didn't even require me to play their game. Things have definitely changed around here. The HOA is gone, completely dismantled. I mean, it's hard to believe it, but it's true. The once mighty HOA that ruled over every little detail, like whether or not your trash cans were aligned properly or your mailbox was the right shade of beige, is now just a distant memory. Nobody misses it. Nobody. The neighbors? They've started actually talking to each other again. People who were once afraid to even look at each other in fear of breaking some unspoken rule now stop by for a chat. Louis, of course, is still the neighborhood's unofficial mayor. He's got a garden gnome army that's practically legendary now, and he proudly shows off his new official HOA free yard. It cracks me up every time I see him marching around with that proud, silly look on his face. I still work on my truck in the garage, just like before. The difference is that now, when I open the door, I don't feel like I'm being watched or judged. No more scowls from Karen or Richard hiding behind their fake smiles, pretending to be the guardians of community standards. No more sneaky fines for things that don't matter. It's just me and my truck, and that's enough. And yeah, I won. But it wasn't just about keeping my truck. It was about standing up to a system that had gotten too big for its britches. It was about proving that I wasn't going to be intimidated into submission. It was about protecting what's mine, but more than that, it was about giving the whole neighborhood the chance to fight back, too. Sometimes you have to go to the edge of the cliff before you realize there's a way out. What happened to Karen and Richard? Well, their lives unraveled fast after that. Karen tried to keep up her act for a while, but once the investigation started, there wasn't anywhere left for her to hide. I've heard rumors about her moving away, but honestly, I don't care to know the details. She got her comeuppance, and I'm good with that. As for me, life's settled down. I still get a letter now and then, but it's all about neighborhood events, fundraisers, and stuff that actually matters. I've even started helping out with some of the local projects. There's a group of neighbors, a mix of old-timers and new folks, and we're working on a community garden in the old lot down the street. Louie's already planning on putting some gnomes in there, of course, but it's nice to see people pitching in, working together, and not worrying about who's violating the HOA's ridiculous rules. As for my truck, well, it still sits in the driveway, but I don't think of it as just a truck anymore. It's more like a symbol of the fight I won, a reminder of how far I've come. It's a piece of my past, my friendship with Jake, but now it's something I get to keep, on my own terms. It's just me, the truck, and the open road. Nothing in the way. Yeah, man. I've been thinking a lot lately about how different things feel now. There's peace in this neighborhood, real peace. Not the fake kind Karen tried to force with her petty fines and her need for control. The kind of peace that comes when people feel like they have a say in what happens to their own lives. I guess that's the real victory in all this, not just for me, but for everyone here. I don't know what Karen and Richard were expecting when they started this whole thing, but I know what I learned. Sometimes the quiet guy with the truck has more power than the loud ones hiding behind their rules. And for once, that was more than enough.